In 1889, a man named Thomas O'Malley sat across from a Chicago Tribune reporter and said something that would be buried in the archives for over a century. O'Malley had been there. He had worked on the crews that raised the streets of Chicago in the 1850s and 60s. He had seen what was underneath, and what he described wasn't just mud and wooden planks. It was buildings, fully intact buildings with ornate facades, paved streets, and infrastructure that suggested a level of sophistication no one talks about. Today, Chicago's official history says they raised the streets to improve drainage and sanitation. But O'Malley's testimony tells a different story. A story about what was already down there before the raising ever began. This is what the last worker saw. If you are interested in forgotten history that challenges the official narrative, subscribe now, because next week we're examining the 1871 Great Chicago Fire and the architectural evidence that doesn't match the timeline you were taught. Thomas O'Malley was 76 years old when he gave that interview. He had spent his entire adult life in construction, first as a labourer on the street raising projects, then as a foreman on various building sites across Chicago. By 1889, he was one of the last living men who had actually worked the raising operations from the beginning. Most of his crew had died, some from accidents, others from old age. O'Malley was the final voice from that era, and what he remembered didn't match what the history books were already starting to say. Chicago street raising is taught as an engineering marvel. Between 1855 and 1860, the city decided to raise street level by 4 to 14 feet across large portions of downtown. The official reason was flooding. The city sat too low. Streets turned to swamps every spring. Disease spread. So they jacked up buildings, filled in the gaps with dirt and debris, and created a new ground level. Thousands of workers, hundreds of buildings lifted on screw jacks. A testament to American ingenuity. That's the story. But O'Malley remembered something else. He remembered descending, not digging down into virgin soil, but clearing out spaces that were already constructed. He described finding brick-lined tunnels that ran under the streets, some wide enough to drive a carriage through. He talked about paved stone roads below the mud, roads that were older and better constructed than anything they were building on top. And he mentioned buildings, structures with basements that extended multiple levels below what would become the new street surface. Buildings that already had windows, doorways, and architectural details facing downward, as if they had been designed for a street level that was below the one Chicago claimed to be raising. The official narrative says the basements were added after the raising, that building owners simply extended their structures downward to meet the old street level, creating what we now call the underground city or pedway system. But O'Malley's account suggests these spaces existed before the raising crews arrived. He didn't talk about digging, he talked about uncovering, about removing fill, about exposing infrastructure that was already in place. In the interview, O'Malley specifically mentioned a section near Lake Street and Wabash Avenue. He said his crew was tasked with clearing debris from what they thought was a collapsed foundation. But when they removed the rubble, they found a fully intact archway, stone carved with decorative patterns, a granite threshold worn smooth from foot traffic, and beyond the arch, a corridor that extended 30 feet before being blocked by more fill. The foreman ordered them to seal it back up. O'Malley asked why. The foreman said it wasn't part of the plan. They were there to raise streets, not explore what was underneath. That response stuck with O'Malley for nearly 40 years. It bothered him, because if they were simply lifting buildings and filling in dirt, why would there be anything to explore? Why would there be sealed archways and worn thresholds and corridors that led somewhere the city didn't want them to go? O'Malley also described the quality of the construction they found below. He said the brickwork was superior to anything being built in the 1850s. Tighter joints, harder mortar, stones cut with precision that would have required advanced tools. He mentioned metal fixtures that didn't corrode the way iron should. Pipes that carried water with no visible pump system. Ventilation shafts that seemed to draw air from somewhere deeper, though no one could find the source. When the reporter asked how deep the structures went, O'Malley said he didn't know. They were never allowed to find out. Every time a crew broke through into one of these older spaces, supervisors would arrive and redirect the work. Fill it in, move to the next block, don't ask questions. O'Malley estimated they sealed off at least 24 major structures during his time on the project. Structures that, according to the official story, shouldn't have existed at all. The reporter pressed him on this. How could entire buildings be underground if Chicago had only been incorporated as a city in 1837? Where did these structures come from? O'Malley didn't have an answer. He only knew what he saw, and what he saw didn't fit the timeline he had been taught. After the interview, the Chicago Tribune never published the full account. A brief mention appeared in a later edition, but it focused on O'Malley's age and his service to the city's development. The details about the underground structures were left out. The interview notes were filed away and forgotten until a researcher stumbled on them in 2003 while digging through archives related to the 1871 fire. But O'Malley wasn't the only one who noticed. Other workers from the same era left similar accounts in personal letters and diaries. A man named Samuel Greeley wrote to his brother in 1858 describing a chamber they uncovered near Randolph Street. He said it had marble floors and columns that looked Roman. Another worker, Patrick Donnelly, mentioned in his journal that the crew found gas lamps already installed in tunnels below State Street, lamps that were lit when they broke through, though no one could explain who had been maintaining them. These accounts were scattered, fragmented, dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings, but taken together they paint a consistent picture. The Chicago street raising wasn't just about lifting buildings, it was about covering something that was already there. The consistency across these separate testimonies is striking. Workers who never met each other, who worked on different blocks years apart, described the same phenomenon. Underground passages with advanced construction, streets below the streets, buildings facing downward, and always the same response from supervisors when discoveries were made. Seal it, move on, don't discuss it with anyone outside the crew. In one account from 1862, a worker named James Mitchell wrote about finding a foundation stone with a date carved into it. The date was 1796. Mitchell showed it to his foreman, who took the stone and told Mitchell he had misread the carving. But Mitchell was certain. He had traced the numbers with his fingers. The stone was older than Chicago was supposed to be. The foreman made the stone disappear, and Mitchell never saw it again. Another pattern emerged in the workers' descriptions of the underground spaces. Many mentioned finding rooms that appeared to be designed for specific purposes. Not just empty basements, but spaces with built-in furniture, shelving carved into stone walls, and drainage systems more sophisticated than anything Chicago had in the 1850s. O'Malley specifically remembered a chamber near Madison Street that had a domed ceiling with acoustic properties. When workers spoke, their voices carried in a way that suggested the room had been designed for gatherings or performances. The acoustics were too precise to be accidental. The fill material itself raised questions that engineers at the time couldn't answer. When crews dug down to reach the old street level before raising buildings, they encountered layers that didn't make geological sense. There would be compressed earth, then a layer of brick fragments, then more earth, then wooden beams, then stone rubble. Each layer appeared to have been deposited at different times, with periods of settling in between. But according to Chicago's official timeline, the city had only existed for 20 years. How do you get a century's worth of stratified deposits in 2 decades? Modern engineers who have studied the raising often focus on the mechanical achievement. How did they lift entire buildings without collapsing them? How did they coordinate moving thousands of structures at once? But they rarely ask a more fundamental question. Why was the fill below the original street level already compacted and settled, as if it had been there for decades or longer? Why did core samples taken in the 1990s show layers of ash, organic material, and construction debris at depths that predate Chicago's official founding? A civil engineer named Robert Chen reviewed historical surveys of the raising project in 2007. He noticed something peculiar in the elevation records. The amount of fill material required to raise certain blocks didn't match the volume actually used. In some areas, workers reported using significantly less fill than the calculations suggested they would need. Chen's conclusion was that portions of the space were already occupied. The underground wasn't empty. It was partially filled with structures that reduced the amount of new material required. Chen also examined photographs from the era. In several images of buildings being raised, you can see exposed foundations in the background. Some of these foundations show construction techniques that weren't common in 1850s Chicago. Arched doorways with Roman-style voussoirs, brick patterns typical of much older European construction. And in one photograph, barely visible in the shadows, what appears to be carved stonework with decorative elements that wouldn't become popular in American architecture until the 1890s, yet the photo was taken in 1857. One geologist noted that the soil composition under downtown Chicago doesn't match what you'd expect from natural sediment. There are distinct stratification patterns that suggest intentional layering. Fill material mixed with fragments of worked stone and metal. Compressed layers that would take centuries to settle, not the 20 years between the city's founding and the street raising. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, a geologist at Northwestern, studied soil samples from downtown Chicago construction sites between 2012 and 2015. Carbon dating of materials at depths of 12 to 15 feet suggested ages ranging from 200 to 400 years old, materials that should not exist in a city founded in 1833. Her research funding was quietly discontinued. The 1871 fire destroyed 3.5 square miles, including most buildings raised in the 1850s and 60s. The fire erased physical evidence from the raising period. In the rebuilding, strict new codes required different foundation depths and documentation. Whatever had been down there was now buried under new construction. O'Malley died in 1891, 2 years after the interview. His obituary mentioned his work on the street raising, but said nothing about what he had seen below. The structures he described were never excavated. The tunnels were never mapped. The questions he raised were never answered. His family kept his personal papers, including sketches he had made of some of the underground chambers. Those papers disappeared sometime in the early 1900s. No known copies exist. Today, if you walk through Chicago's pedway system, you're moving through a network of tunnels and basements that the city says were created after the street raising. But some of those spaces have architectural features that don't fit that timeline. Keystones carved with symbols that weren't common in 1860s Chicago, ventilation systems that predate the technology supposedly available at the time, and in a few locations, brickwork that matches patterns found in much older European cities, cities that were thriving centuries before Chicago was supposed to exist. Preservation efforts in the 1990s documented some of these anomalies. Architectural surveys noted decorative elements that didn't match known Chicago construction styles, stone carvings with weathering patterns inconsistent with their supposed age, metal fixtures made from alloys not commercially available in the 1850s, foundation stones bearing marks resembling European Masonic symbols from the 1700s. These details appeared in technical reports filed with the city, but never made it into public interpretations of Chicago's history. The official history of Chicago is a story of rapid growth, a frontier town that became a major city in less than 50 years. But O'Malley's testimony, along with the accounts of other workers and the physical evidence still visible today, suggests a different possibility. What if Chicago wasn't built from scratch? What if the street raising wasn't about elevation, but about concealment? What if the city we see today is simply the latest layer of something much older? The last worker who helped raise the streets in 1889 said there was already a city down there, a city with streets, buildings, and infrastructure that no one wanted to acknowledge, a city that was buried intentionally. And if Chicago had a hidden history, what other cities might be hiding theirs? The question isn't whether Thomas O'Malley saw what he said he saw. The question is why no one wanted him to talk about it. and why, more than a century later, we're still not allowed to look down there.